Yes.
Hello and welcome back to the Center for Critical and Cultural Theory. This is going to be a lecture on structuralism. And so I want to work through multiple figures here, so it might take multiple videos. But I'm going to start with Ferdinand de Saussure and thinking about linguistics, although structuralism as a phenomenon in terms of theory, whether we're talking about theory in general or more literary theory or linguistic theory, it bridges multiple branches of disciplines dealing with language and literary interpretation. So I'm going to share my screen here. With my notes. And I've got to move my little Zoom thing out of the way here. Okay. So some contextual history. When we're thinking about structuralism, this is a movement that begins in the 20th century or the early 20th century. It's not like a term that someone just comes up and says, I'm a structuralist. Um, it's applied later on when we think about kind of thought moves that are happening among major thinkers. So we could think, and I've talked about this in other videos, of like Sigmund Freud's Oedipal complex as a kind of structuralist way of talking about human development. Now we can critique different parts of his Oedipal complex for whether or not he's correct or not. That's not my concern here. It's just to mention that he has a kind of model and a method by which he wants to explain the phenomenon of human development from the early age through up through puberty and the things that we have not moved through that might carry on to adulthood that are repressed, all of that sort of stuff that plays into his theory. That psychoanalytic theory is which deals with a kind of structuralism. Linguistically, we can take the work of Ferdinand de Saussure, who is a Swiss thinker, and his early course on course in general linguistics. And so what we have from that course, which became very influential on a number of other thinkers, and so what we're getting is his lecture notes sort of put back together by his students, sort of like if you're reading Aristotle's book on rhetoric, right? It's not a book that Aristotle himself produced, but it's made up of kind of like lecture notes from his students. And so, nevertheless, this course in general linguistics has been really, really influential for linguistic theory in the 20th century and for lots of other literary theory as well. So while linguistics as a discipline moves on, just like psychoanalysis moves on after Freud and goes to Lacan and goes to Kristeva or later thinkers, uh, um, uh, there's that kind of trajectory of linguistics, and then there's also just sort of the broader influence that Ferdinand de Saussure has in terms of like literary interpretation. So it's important to see, as I say in my notes here, two motivating factors, I think, in the growth of structuralism in the early 20th century. The first is the rise of the social sciences, and the impulse is to create a science of linguistics and semiology. So semiology is going to be the study of signs themselves. And then the second, I think, important historical piece here is going to be a massive upheaval in European politics between World War I and World War II. Now, this is important to note because Ferdinand de Saussure's course in general linguistics took place before World War I, right? So what we're looking at is a general sort of cultural impact and situation in which his thinking in this course gets really broadened throughout many disciplines. And I want to give a little bit of context here. even to move on way past Ferdinand de Saussure and think about where we're going in a trajectory of structuralism, even including what Americans critics would call post-structuralism, although that's not the language that was generally used on the European continent. So there isn't like this hard break in the European continental thought between sort of structuralism and post-structuralism. It's just all versions of structuralism. Just like postmodernism isn't just a rejection of modernism, but oftentimes an extension of, sometimes a radicalization of modernism, so that we're not thinking about binary opposites when we're adding the post in. So after World War II, of course, Europe is just devastated from the war. There had been a French Republic that the Third Republic that gets taken over by the Nazi occupation in France. And then they set up what's called the Vichy government, right? That's the occupation government under the Germans. Then there's the people who are in the resistance. During the French resistance, the head of the resistant powers is Charles de Gaulle, and who later becomes president under the newly established Fourth Republic in France. And so what we see is in France that there have been multiple revolutions, and this is something that's maybe kind of hard for Americans to sometimes understand because we think of the American Revolution and that's it. But there's been restructuring of the French government multiple times since the French Revolution, which happens, close to the same time as the American Revolution, just a little bit after. So it's important to think that there's a revisitation constantly in France of the values of what the original sort of French Revolution in the late 1700s meant. The Fourth Republic arises from 1946 to 1958, and that is going to be the kind of post-World War II time. And what across the board, whether it's in the arts, whether it's in the sciences, whether it's in just sort of the general fabric of social life, as the Fourth Republic gets going, there's critique among French thinkers about the way things were in the Third Republic. There's a particular critique going on in terms of classism, and that they don't want to see in the new republic those types of class divisions being reasserted. And so what comes with this is a real time of experimentation in French thought in general, continental thought broader than France for sure, but especially in France. And so ultimately, there's all this social change going on. And then in the late 50s, we see more and more of the decolonization. It's kind of going throughout the 1950s. You can think about it even in terms of the liberation of India from Britain in 1948, and throughout Africa, because the European powers can't continue their colonial hold on Africa after Europe is in shambles in the war. You see all of these countries declaring independence in Africa. And so, particularly in French Algeria, there's a bunch of tensions in the late 1950s. And there's a lot of social critique in France going on about the fact that France has occupied. Remember, this is about the time that France is moving out of its occupation in Vietnam. And then the United States goes in and takes over the occupation in Vietnam. And this is because, of course, in the 1960s becomes a really controversial thing for Americans. But back to France here really quickly. Here, we're thinking about this, there's a big tension, and I'm going to broadly put the political tension between Gaullism, which is kind of like a right-wing kind of control thing, but definitely not Nazi right wing, or definitely resistance to National Socialism, and then more left wing communism in France. And so communism is not vilified. It's not necessarily as evil in France as the way that it takes shape in the United States during the McCarthy era and the Red Scare of the 1950s. So communism is a viable idea politically in France, and it has a lot to do with France's involvement in Indochina and its relationship with China. And remember, China is going communist during this time, and so we can't take just sort of traditional Americanist political influences when we're thinking about literary theory, linguistic theory, and just general continental philosophy in the 20th century here. So I'll situate the tension between Gaullism and communism here. There are many intellectuals that are famous from this era. So Jean-Paul Sartre, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, Roland Barthes, early Claude Lévi-Strauss they were all optimistic about something that communism might bring in one form or another. So the Third Republic in France, so this is what gets devastated by the Nazi invasion. There's the rejection of bourgeois values, middle class values, and that classism that they see in the Third Republic. And that's where you see that kind of leftist impulse sort of coming in among the French thinkers of this period. So for the young thinkers, what they're trying to do, it's not just to reinstate a republic, but to think about what a Fourth Republic is going to do. What kind of art is the Fourth Republic going to bring out that's going to signal to everybody their rejection, for example, of those bourgeois values from earlier on, the classism that constituted the Third Republic in France? So when all of this comes to a head in 1958, there's a conflict with Algeria. Charles de Gaulle, who's the leader in France, and he's the leader throughout much of the 50s, and he goes away and then he comes back in the 60s. So that's an important thing as well. So he's the leader. De Gaulle had been one of the reasons why he was so popular was because he had been the leader, in quotes, of the French resistance to the Nazi occupation in World War II. Now, it's not like to be in the French resistance, it's not exactly an organized thing as well, too. So that's why I have leader in quotes as well. So de Gaulle is the official leader, but there are lots of, it's not like you signed up to be in the French resistance. So you don't want to confuse, I say, the leader of Charles de Gaulle during World War II with the leader Pétain, who was the leader of the Vichy government. That's the occupation government. So he's kind of a puppet governmental figure put in by the Nazis. So in the late 50s, there's this tension with North Africa. There's another revolution that brings in the Fifth Republic for France, which still exists today, although we do maybe not. Maybe there might be a Sixth Republic in the future if you've been following the French news lately. And so during the Fifth Republic, Charles de Gaulle's politics, or Gaullism, tended to be more right-wing and toward action-oriented solutions to problems like the Algerian crisis. So go in and forcefully take control, whereas the left-leaning intellectuals were more for the liberation of the previous colonial territories. So left-leaning intellectuals reacted against both Gaullism and what they saw as bourgeois conservatism in places like the Sorbonne, which is the big university in France, in Paris, and professors such as Raymond Picard, who criticized Roland Barthes for being pseudoscientific. To be engaged with structuralism during this period was also simultaneously to be engaged in left-leaning politics. And this is something that we always need to think about when we're doing our theoretical work, is that it matters what thoughts we think. As Marilyn Strathern, the great anthropologist, has said, and other thinkers have echoed that type of thing, because it matters not only what thoughts we think, but it matters what the tools that we use to think are going to have political, aesthetic, implications, right? So I want to situate this, early talk here, just thinking as we go into Roland Barthes and Ferdinand de Saussure. Yes, there's a way to think of them as linguists, structural linguistics, but there's an entire kind of politics associated with the kind of thinking and the kind of inquiry that they're doing into structures of society to begin with, right? So we need to think about that as the context. Now I'm going to drop back and think about Roland Barthes here for a second, and then we'll go into Ferdinand de Saussure, and we're going to sort of maneuver our way through this series of videos. So I've got a picture here of Barthes here. Francois Doss, who has a great history of structuralism from 1945 to 66, it's actually multiple volumes long. He opens his discussion of structuralism with a quote from a later thinker, oftentimes associated with post-structuralism, as the Americans call it, Michel Foucault. Structuralism is not a new method. It is the awakened and troubled consciousness of modern thought, says Michel Foucault, who died in the early 80s, but a very important academic thinker across multiple disciplines. So there appears to be quite different, this appears to be quite different than simply finding a way to found a scientific discipline, which we see in early Ferdinand de Saussure. So if we think about back to the early 20th century, there's been positivism developing in the late 19th century, the development of the so-called soft sciences or the social sciences, psychoanalysis being thrown in there as well, but also anthropology, sociology as well. And so all of them are driven by scientific positivism, especially by this guy, Auguste Comte, whose scientific method develops this notion of positivism. And so that carries over into the study of languages and into the study of literature. So especially early, and throughout the 20th century in general, literary studies is oftentimes competing with the so-called sciences and in their own ways trying to come up with a science. And that doesn't matter if we're talking about Mikhail Bakhtin or the earlier developments in Russia, in Soviet Russian, like Vladimir Prop, for example, and Morphology of a Folk Tale, or Bakhtin, who is writing his various but now collected essays on discourse and the novel during that time period. There's this impulse to kind of create a literary inquiry that is scientific in nature. So later on, we get this much more kind of flowery, like rhetoric that's associated with post-structuralism, where Foucault says this statement like that structuralism is not a new method. It's the awakened and troubled consciousness of modern thought. The concerns of mid-20th century French intellectuals, I'm just reading my notes here, are motivated by their political situation and by an idea of modernity expressed by Foucault above. It expressed itself in structuralism as a certain kind of writing that performed critique. That's really important to think about, that structuralism is a kind of writing itself. It's helpful to understand that people like Roland Barthes, who were studying philology in the 1940s, or the history of language, right? Just linguistic forms, the history of words, like if you go to the online etymology dictionary, so how words are built up from earlier words, how they mix and mesh with different languages. That's what he's studying when he comes up with his thoughts on semiotics. Roland Barthes was also reacting to Jean-Paul Sartre's brand of existentialism, and particularly a famous book by Sartre called Literature and Existentialism, which contains a chapter called Why Write? And so this is a key passage from that particular book. This is Jean-Paul Sartre. One can imagine a good novel being written by an American Negro, even if hatred of whites were spread all over it, because it is the freedom of his race that he demands through this hatred. And as he invites me to assume the attitude of generosity, the moment I feel myself a pure freedom, I cannot bear to identify myself with a race of oppressors. Thus, I require all freedoms of all freedoms that they demand the liberation of colored people against the white race and against myself insofar as I am part of it. But nobody can suppose for a moment that it's possible to write a good novel in praise of anti-Semitism. For the moment I feel that my freedom is indissolubly linked with that of all other men, it cannot be demanded of me that I use it to approve the enslavement of a part of these men. Hence, any attempt to enslave his readers threatens him in his very art. And then later on, just a page later, one does not write for slaves. The art of prose is bound up with the only regime in which prose has meaning, democracy. When one is threatened, the other is too. And it is not enough to defend them with the pen. A day comes when the pen is forced to stop, and the writer must then take up arms. Thus, however you might have come to it, whatever the opinions you might have professed, literature throws you into battle. Writing is a certain way of wanting freedom. Once you have begun, you are engaged willy-nilly. So Sartre is not exactly. You could throw Sartre into structuralism a bit as well. He's working with people associated with existentialism, and there are definitely structures to that thinking as well, like the structures of Dasein and being towards death that we might get from philosophers like Martin Heidegger, who are really influential on Sartre. I'm not going to go into that here right now, but just to say that I'm using Sartre's opening phrases here to show how Roland Barthes and his structuralism, maybe later post-structuralism, is reacting to that, but also it just captures the cultural moment, right? To be a writer about language and structuralism in France is not at all an apolitical act at the time. It's very much associated with a question concerning freedom. Notice that even though Sartre is very left-leaning, even Marxist, and communist leaning at times, he still believes that that is democratic, and democratic is the best way, that you can't have good art unless it is democratic to begin with. But that leftism that he has, even though it's democratic, is going to be a strong reaction to right-wing conservatism in France under Charles de Gaulle when he's president in the 50s, and then especially when he comes back in the 1960s. Although literature and existentialism comes out quite earlier than that. So in these passages that I just read here, we see that the post-war attitude on the left is siding with efforts of decolonization, particularly of Africa, but also of African American people in the United States, or Black people in general around the world. So the structuralism in France combines itself with a rehabilitated notion of Marxist critique. This is the humanist Marx after the 1840s work became available. So for people who don't know or haven't read this stuff before, like there's a significant portion of Marx's early thinking that wasn't translated widely or available outside of the German, and it definitely wasn't therefore influenced a big influence on people like Lenin and Trotsky, and the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, which is a form of Marxian, it's a trajectory of Marxian thought, or takes itself to be that, but it doesn't, there are, more hardcore Marxists who would say that it kind of misses the boat for what pure Marxism might be. And so that there's a distinction between what becomes Soviet communism, especially under someone like Stalin, which kind of gives up the Marxian ideals, right? But a lot of times my American students don't learn about the distinctions between any of those different notions of Marxism and communism. So just to let you know that there's a kind of flourishing of interest in Marx in the 1940s and 50s because there's been a wider translation of his earlier stuff. So Roland Barthes breaks with Jean-Paul Sartre early on, and he publishes a book called Writing Degree Zero in 1953, and it gets a lot of critical acclaim. And according to Doss, this is in his book History of Structuralism, Barthes adhered to the Sartrean theme of freedom conquered through the act of writing, but he innovated, no longer situating the commitment represented by writing in the content, but rather the form. So he says it's not just what I write about. It's not like that I write about someone who's fighting for their freedom, but it's actually in the structure of language itself, says Roland Barthes, and that's his break. It's not in the content. It's not what's like. It's not who the characters are in my stories. It's how I write and how I use language. So language became a finality, according to Doss here, identified with reconquered freedom. Literature, however, was at a 0 point to be reconquered. It had degenerated through its dissolution in a daily language made up of habits and prescriptions, and through stylistics, which leads to an autarkic mode, to an ideology which the author acts as if he were to cut off from society and cut off from society, and reduced to a splendid isolation. So this needs to be kept in mind as part of the impetus for Barthes as he turns towards linguistics and semiology. In his 1964 book, Elements of Semiology, Barthes takes it upon himself to describe a new science that Saussure had called for in his course on general linguistics. So that's why I'm starting with Barthes here, and I'm throwing out all of these figures, but we see in Barthes, he's trying to still found a new science of semiology, but he's going to be building off of the earlier structuralism of Ferdinand de Saussure, and particularly some claims that Saussure makes at the end of his book. At the same time, he's writing in the highly politicized moment of Fourth Republic France. He's influenced by people like Jean-Paul Sartre, but he's going to push it a step further. So he's definitely like left-leaning like Sartre, but he's reacting by saying that what we need to look at is change the fabric and the structure of society itself. And when we think about literature in the new Republic of France, we can't return to the bourgeois ideals of high art and high literature that constituted the Third Republic. We need to reformulate our entire aesthetics of thinking about what language is and what literature is with it. And what the concept here is called a writing degree 0. Let's start at a new 0 base. And what's that going to be? That is the question for theorists. It's also the question for artists. It's aligned with leftism for sure, but it's also rebuilding. Where do we rebuild our society from when our society has been destroyed? This is going to end video 1 in this series on structuralism itself, semiotics as well. I'll go into Ferdinand de Saussure and his course on general linguistics in my next video. Thanks for watching and being here.